You've been shot how many times?
9 times.
Where were you shot?
Most of them in the legs. I got hit in my hand and I got hit in the face.
Pain-wise, how bad is it to get shot in the face?
Probably,
Is it a 10?
it's not really like as painful as having to visit the dentist repeatedly for root canal.
What is it still in your tongue?
Yeah, it's great for oral sex.
Did you ever find out who did it?
Yeah, I know who did it shortly after.
And they are now where?
The guy who actually shot me is dead.
9 shots. 9. And he survived all of them. Not metaphorically, not in a movie. On a street in South Jamaica, Queens, on May 24, 2000, Curtis James Jackson III was ambushed outside his grandmother's home. A gunman walked up and fired 9 rounds from a 9mm handgun. Jackson was hit in his hand, his arm, his hip, both legs, his chest, and his face. A bullet fragment lodged in his tongue, permanently altering the way he spoke. He was in the hospital for 13 days. And then he came out and became 50 Cent. That is the story we are getting into today. Not just the survival, but what he did with it. Because surviving 9 bullets is extraordinary. Building a music, television, and business empire on the other side of it is something else entirely. The beginning was not kind either. Curtis Jackson was born on July 6, 1975 in Queens, New York. His mother Sabrina had him at 15, and she raised him in the South Jamaica neighborhood while supporting them both by selling drugs. She was the person who lit up every room she walked into, the kind of warmth you remember your whole life. Curtis was 8 years old when she was killed. The accounts suggest it was a business dispute that went fatally wrong. She was gone, and he was left with his grandparents in a grief he did not fully understand until years later. His grandparents were good people, stable, old-fashioned, doing their best. But the streets of South Jamaica in the 1980s were a different kind of education. By the time Curtis was 12, he was selling crack. He told his grandparents he was in after-school programs. He was not. He was learning an entirely different curriculum: how to read people, how to survive, how to move in environments where the wrong decision had permanent consequences. It caught up with him. In high school, he was caught by metal detectors carrying a weapon. Then, he was arrested for selling crack to an undercover cop. A search of his home turned up heroin, more crack, and a pistol. He was sentenced and served 7 months in boot camp, came out with a GED, and made a decision about who he was going to be next. He took the name 50 Cent, borrowed from Kelvin Martin, a Brooklyn stick-up man from the 1980s who operated under that nickname. To Curtis, Martin represented a specific kind of toughness, someone who made his own way regardless of what the world said was available to him. The name was a statement of identity before a single record had been recorded. The music started simply. He was in a friend's basement in 1996, recording over instrumentals, figuring it out. That same friend introduced him to Jam Master Jay from Run DMC, who was starting his own label. Jay became Curtis's first real teacher. He drilled him on bar counts, hook writing, and song structure. He made him write the chorus 3 or 4 times before touching a verse. Those lessons built the foundation that would eventually carry 50s music to the top of every chart in America. By 1999, he had outgrown Jay's label and signed with Columbia Records under the Trackmasters production duo. He recorded 36 tracks in 2 weeks, 18 of which made the album Power of the Dollar. Then he dropped How to Rob, a song he wrote on a car ride to the studio that mapped out exactly how he would rob hip-hop's biggest names. It was funny, bold, and impossible to ignore. Icons like Jay-Z and DMX responded. Nas invited him on the Nostradamus tour. And then the shooting happened. He had just gotten into a friend's car outside his grandmother's former home when a gunman approached from another vehicle and opened fire. Jackson was not aware of who or why until it was over. He survived. His friend was also wounded. 3 weeks later, the suspected shooter was killed. Jackson spent 13 days in the hospital, walked with a walker for 6 weeks, and recovered physically within 5 months. But professionally, everything collapsed. Columbia Records dropped him. He was blacklisted. Word moved through the industry that he was too dangerous, too much of a liability. The shooting that would eventually make him a legend first made him unemployable. He did not stop. He moved to Canada and recorded over 30 songs for mixtapes. He took other artists' beats and recorded over them, something that was legally gray, but strategically genius. It put his voice over familiar production, into ears that already trusted those sounds. He sold those mixtapes out of the back of his own car in New York. He built his name back from nothing, one sale at a time. In 2002, he released Guess Who's Back. The mixtape reached Eminem, who was at that point one of the biggest artists in the world. Eminem listened and did not hesitate. He called Jackson to Los Angeles and introduced him to Dr. Dre. The meeting was straightforward. Jackson walked in with presents and left with a deal. Eminem and Dre signed him in a joint venture for $1 million. The album they made together was Get Rich or Die Trying, released in February 2003. 50 Cent recorded his half of it with Dr. Dre in 7 days, walking in, recording, moving on to the next track, driven by something that sounded like a man who had already waited long enough. The lead single, In Da Club, set a radio record as the most listened-to song in radio history within a week of release. The album moved 872,000 copies in its first 4 days. The run it went on, chart performance, cultural dominance, mainstream and street crossover, has been described by people who were there as something they had simply never seen before from a debut. He used that momentum to build. He launched G-Unit Records and signed Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, and Young Buck. He brought in the game through a joint deal with Dr. Dre. The label had an immediate commercial impact, with Banks's debut, The Hunger for More, going platinum. In 2005, The Massacre sold over 1 million copies in 4 days and sat at #1 on the Billboard 200 for 6 weeks. He became the first solo artist to hold 3 singles in the Billboard Top 5 simultaneously. The Ja Rule beef deserves mention because it defined that era of hip-hop as much as the music did. The conflict started years earlier over a robbery connected to someone in their shared neighborhood. It escalated into a studio confrontation, where 50 was cut during a brawl. By the time 50 had Eminem and Dre behind him, he had the artillery to end it. Wanksta mocked Ja Rule's street credibility, and a simultaneous federal investigation into Murder, Inc. drained the label of resources. Ja Rule's power in the industry never fully recovered. 50 later bought 200 front-row seats to a Ja Rule concert and left them empty. The feud became a case study in how to use conflict as both promotion and destruction. In 2007, the industry's direction shifted through 1 week of album sales. 50 Cent's Curtis and Kanye West's Graduation dropped on the same date. 50 had declared publicly that he would retire if Kanye outsold him. Graduation moved more units in the first week. 50 did not retire, but the result meant something real. Gangsta rap's commercial dominance was giving way to something different, and the era that 50 had defined was changing shape around him. He adapted. He launched Cheetah Vision, a production company focused on action thrillers for international markets. Then he partnered with writer Courtney Kemp to create Power on Stars, a drama following a drug dealer trying to go legitimate and failing at every turn. Over 6 seasons, Power grew into one of the most watched shows on premium cable, spinning off multiple successful follow-on series. The Los Angeles Times called it a powerhouse. 50's fingerprints were all over it. The aesthetic, the soundtrack, the hard-hitting narrative instincts that came from someone who had actually lived inside the world the show was depicting. In 2022, he appeared at the Super Bowl halftime show alongside Dr. Dre, Eminem, Snoop Dogg, Kendrick Lamar, and Mary J. Blige, the most culturally significant halftime performance in the event's history. The moment was a confirmation of hip-hop's permanent place in American culture, and 50 was there because he had been part of building it. In Da Club, released over 20 years ago, became only the second pre-YouTube rap video to reach 1 billion views in 2020. A song he recorded in 7 frantic studio days is still finding new listeners. That is what Curtis Jackson built. From losing his mother at 8, to selling drugs at 12, to getting shot 9 times at 24, to being blacklisted and having to sell mixtapes from his own car, to 9-figure business interests and a television empire that is still expanding. The name he borrowed from a Brooklyn stick-up man in the 80s became one of the most recognizable brands in the history of entertainment. The voice that sells records, slightly altered by a bullet fragment that never left his tongue, turned out to be the most distinctive voice of his generation. Everything, as he once said, happens for a reason. What do you think is the most underrated chapter of 50 Cent's career? Drop your take in the comments. Subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind hip-hop's biggest names.